one of the challenges with nitrogen is that, we need it. It's something that's necessary for life. We need it in our bodies. We excrete it in our waste. So nitrogen, I think, in the context of thinking of it relative to an industrial chemical like PFAS, like we could stop production of PFAS and it would eventually sort of slowly dissipate in our environment, right? Because there would be no new sources, but we can't do that with nitrogen. We could restrict all the types of land applications and things that we hear about in terms of discharges, but we would still have it in our waste streams and our wastewater. So it's a little bit more of a challenging matter to address just because we sort of know the beneficial roles that it plays, and we're never going to be able to be sort of removed from those. And so we should sort of figure out how to appropriately manage its use and then think of effective ways to sort of manage its waste. I mean, I think the Des Moines Waterworks and the Central Iowa Waterworks are doing the best they can with source waters that are pretty vulnerable to contamination. The water comes in to their source waters, the water that they're using to feed into their plants to treat and then pass on to consumers. They don't really have the control over protecting it as much as they would like. So they're up against it, and I think they're doing a pretty good job, all things considered. That they have to take water that's impaired or unsafe based on sort of how we regulate drinking water and treat it in a way so that it can be safe to consume in meeting all the federal standards. And I think that job gets harder and harder for them because we're not really improving the quality of our source water. Climate change is making the reliability of our source water a little more vulnerable, a little uncertain as things dry up and we have these dry periods where maybe our rivers might be low, and then they have to think about how they're going to sort of blend their different sources to make sure they can meet all of the health-based requirements that are in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So I think they're doing everything they can to be as transparent about how they're treating the water, the results that they're obtaining, the testing that they're conducting, all while getting steeper and steeper odds against them to sort of make those marks, given that the water is not the source water, we call it, isn't getting any more clean through time.
With that, where are we more likely to see Iowans who are consuming water that doesn't meet safe drinking water standards?
I think the most vulnerable consumers in Iowa are probably folks on private wells. They fall outside of Safe Drinking Water Act regulation, and so we do a lot of it of work trying to understand the water quality for private well consumers. And if you go to the EPA website, it says very plainly that we tend to see some of the more extreme cases of people consuming unsafe water. Basically, in private wells where folks don't know that their water's contaminated, they're not protected under the same sorts of health-based standards and testing guidelines that are in the Safe Drinking Water Act for what we call community water systems, like the Des Moines Waterworks. So they're going to have to be responsible for taking the initiative and getting testing done. If there's a problem that the testing reveals, they need to invest in treatment as a private well owner. And so they end up being ones that when we think about nitrate in groundwater, that can be high. If we think about if they're living near another contamination source like PFAS discharges near landfills or airports, until, unfortunately they get a test that tells them so. Um, and those are probably the most vulnerable. We do a lot of work also thinking about smaller systems, and I think we're finding that smaller rural systems are probably going to start creeping more and more into that category simply because they're going to have harder and harder times making sure their source waters are treated to where they fully are compliant with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Des Moines is a pretty good scenario considering they're a large community and the waterworks and the Central Iowa Waterworks has technical capacity and infrastructure to treat water. A lot of our smaller communities don't. And so when you start thinking about small rural communities, when we think about smaller water systems like manufactured housing communities or even small HOAs, we take for granted that you still need a good amount of expertise and resource to treat water effectively and make it safe. So if source waters are getting more and more vulnerable or changing through time through pollution or climate change, anybody that's not really well positioned to treat that water and ensure its safety, you run the risk that there might be drinking water being delivered to consumers that's not really what it should be.
So from what I gather, I mean, that's happening now on some level, but you anticipate it'll get worse?
Well, there's not a lot of signs that things are, I mean, what I would say when it comes to the water we have available to us, whether it's our groundwater aquifers or whether it's our surface waters, if we're not doing a better job of keeping them free from contamination, and shallow groundwater can get contaminated through land application of chemicals, surface waters we know have runoff as well as discharges that come from industry and cities. Um, all the measures that we're seeing, especially when you hear about nitrate levels in the news, is, it seems like we're not making significant progress towards making those source waters more reliable. So if we're going to continue to see them get degraded with chemical contaminants or microbial contaminants, that's going to make the job harder for water system operators and consumers to find reliable drinking water. You layer on top of that things like climate change, where we can swing between drought and heavy rainfall that can lead to more runoff. I mean, from the standpoint of thinking about different things that stress our water resources, it feels like those stresses are increasing, which is going to make it harder and harder to continue to meet growing demand as Iowa wants to, grow population and communities want to grow. You need reliable water, and there's only so much safe, clean, reliable fresh water to go around, particularly if we're having to use specialized treatment to make sure it meets all the federal standards.
Is it convincing to you that there's a link between nitrate and cancer, or convincing to other scientists from what you gather?
So my response is that, the EPA, I usually just go back to the EPA in 2010, felt that there was enough new evidence and new science that they should redo the health assessment for nitrate in drinking water. And so I would say that if the EPA back in 2010 found the science compelling enough that they felt they would need to go back and conduct a new health assessment to determine if they needed to revise the Safe Drinking Water Act standard, that's sort of a signal that if that at the time the leading experts that think about environmental health at the EPA felt that was convincing enough to trigger the need for new assessment, that's something we should be paying attention to. That's significant in my mind. Now that health assessment has not been completed because it's the process, I think, through multiple administrations has become largely politicized. But those processes of every so often reviewing our Safe Drinking Water Act standards to ensure that they're sufficient and keeping up with science, they're there to make sure new information that comes available gets considered, and the EPA hasn't done that. And so it's really not up to me to say that I find it convincing or not. I mean, I think the EPA has signaled, and our problem, probably more importantly, is that we're not getting the right sort of protection for public health through the types of that hasn't been done yet to give people the certainty. And it's quite possible they could run that health assessment and say nothing should change because the science isn't compelling enough. But it's the fact that needs to get done. So I think the science is enough to make us be reconsidering. EPA is acknowledged as such, and I think that puts us in a bit of a tough bind while we wait for that to get resolved because we have lots of communities that are in that range where many folks and studies have said that it could be unsafe for things beyond blue baby syndrome, which is what we regulate nitrate for, but for longer term unwanted health exposures and outcomes like cancer.
So, as you probably know, there's a lot of people trying to increase testing of nitrate across Iowa. Um, what is the value of having that data, like here in Iowa, even if, it's not like we can send that data. Maybe we could send that data to the EPA actually and say, hey, we've been monitoring.
But
But
again, I mean, even just
yeah.
the act of collecting the data itself doesn't do much if it's not being tied to health outcomes. And that's really hard, right? I mean, first off, those studies are hard. And the studies that have been done in as rigorous a way as they can to sort of account for all the other factors that could be contributing beyond nitrate in drinking water. I think it's important that people are engaged in wanting to measure nitrate. Um, but I would also say, like, it's definitely worthy that we're focused on nitrate as much as we are, but we should not lose sight of the fact that nitrate's not alone. There's going to be other things in our waterways. Our number one impairment for surface waters is because of the presence of bacteria. We don't talk enough about pesticides that move in our waterways, which we know are there because we use a lot of them. We don't talk enough about how pesticides, some science has shown that pesticides can interact with nitrate to make sort of byproducts that are even more problematic than either one, so that there's this additive or even potentially synergistic effect. So I think it's good, but part of me actually is concerned that we're so dug in that the nitrate issue is going to be hard to ever really make real progress on. We probably need to be able to hold it in our thought that, nitrate is one symptom of the problem, but there are likely others. And we should continue to want to expand and advocate for more testing and more monitoring just so we fully understand all the things that are in our waterways, because it's not just nitrate. It's good that we're focused on that, but it's so much more than that. I mean, there was a study out of Nebraska that was finding both atrazine and nitrate exposure were linked to certain forms of childhood cancer, at least associations they were finding by doing epidemiology. And there's been a lot of studies that have looked at how nitrate, when ingested with atrazine, can lead to formation of the same types of byproducts that we worry about in terms of like nitrosamines that people have linked to cancer and other health outcomes. And so, you know, I think like I said, I think nitrate's one symptom. I'm glad we're talking about it, but I think we pretty well know that we have a nitrate problem in Iowa, and we don't seem to be making good progress in addressing it. Um, we could solve the nitrate problem and still have poor water quality, and we have to keep that in mind.